Welcome to our channel, $1 Million Made Easy. On this channel, we love to run numbers for people, set up spreadsheets, and kind of deal with what's going on in people's lives financially. Recently, the Social Security Fairness Act was passed, and it caused some consternation. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how Social Security works. What they do is they have what's called an adjusted wage index. In other words, the average income in 2023 was $66,621.80. And so what they do is go back, I've got the chart going all the way back to 1951. What they said, if you were making the average wage back in 1951 was $2,799.16. So when they're figuring out your Social Security, how much you've paid in and how much you should be getting, they're not going to give you credit for this much. They're going to give you credit for a lot more than that. And here's the actual ratio that they use. What they do is they take, for example, if you're making the average wage of this in 1951, that's the equivalent of making this in 2023. So they want to give you a ratio of 23.806 to make that equal to the 66,000 that you were making in 2023 to make this an equivalency. What I've got is somebody's actual numbers here, and I'm going to go on up here because we did, go back to 1951. Here's where their very first job, and this is where the problem comes in. This individual had a job that they were not paying Social Security into. Maybe it was some kind of a government job, some kind of job where they weren't paying Social Security. But earlier in their life, they were, for example, in 1967, they had a job where their Social Security wages were taken out. So in this case, 1967, they made $1,298. So if you take that times the ratio, 12.7789, which was again calculated from this to this, they actually give you credit for actually earning $16,587 in 1967. There were no wages in 68, 60, 67, 68, and 69. Excuse me, 68 through 70. Again, they started working again in 1971. And this is the adjusted wages for this job. Now, we'll go down through here. Finally, they got this government job, this job where they weren't paying Social Security on the wages. And these were the wages they were making. They also still had a job where they did pay the wages. So in other words, the adjusted wages for these years are nothing because they didn't pay into Social Security. So they're not adjusted at all. Go down through here. All these years, they're working a job. They're not paying into Social Security. Then finally, they start paying into Social Security again on a second job. And they end up working 35 years at a second job. At the same time, they're working 35 years at this government job. This job, they're not paying Social Security. This job, there is. This is the adjusted wages based on this formula right over here. So here's what we end up with right here. Let's see if we can go back up here and get it. Okay, so the high 35 income from these right here equals, let me see if I can get this up a little bit higher. These adjusted wages for the job they did pay Social Security on ended up being $580,000, 494. Divide that by 35 years times 12 is 420. So this is the PIA amount that they actually be getting, $1,382. And what happened was they used what's called bend points. The first 1,175 of this amount right here, this PIA, is what you're going to get 40% of that if you have this secondary job or this main job where you're not paying in Social Security. You were getting 40% of that. So you'd get $470. That's 40% of this first bend point. That's how they break down how much you get in Social Security. The second part of it, you get 32% of that. So you get 6628 because you were getting 1382 minus the 1175. You were getting 32% of that. So you're getting $636.28. Now, most people get 90% of what that first bend point is. So they would be getting 1,057, and then the 32% would be the 628 left over. So they'd be getting 1,123 if they didn't have this job over here. They weren't paying Social Security. So here's what's actually happening here. This is how it used to be before they rewrote the law for the Social Security Fairness Act. If you had substantial earnings of 20 years or less, you'd get 40% of what they were promising you. That's how the 40% came in. They came along and they figured that was not fair for some people. Here's what substantial earnings means. You had to make, in 2023, you had to make $29,700 to be considered to have this year of substantial earnings. So in other words, if you had a secondary job all the way through the time that you were making uh, uh, a government job where you weren't paying Social Security, you'd have to have another job paying you 30 years of substantial earnings. These are the substantial earnings you would have had to have on top of your job that you weren't paying into Social Security. Then you would get 90%. If you had 25 years of these substantial earnings, you would get 65%. But if you didn't have, if you had 20 or less, you just get the 40%. So there's the 40%. There's somebody with a government job that they weren't paying Social Security, or any job they weren't paying Social Security, they'd only get 40% of what they actually paid in. This is again what they actually paid in, adjusted wages, 580,000, but they weren't going to get 40% of that first bend point, the first 1175. They weren't going to get 90%. They were going to get 40%. So this is what they were going to get. This is what they're getting in Social Security. They were getting $536 a month. Now, once this act kicked in, they go up to the 90%. They no longer look at this right here, this substantial earnings. They're going to be pushed up to this 90%, and now they're going to get that. And so the difference was 90% of that first bend point, that first amount you're getting, figuring Social Security based on your PIA here, this is what you would get. You get 1,057 plus the 32% of it left over. So now they're going to start getting $1,123 a month instead of this $536 a month. That's a difference of $587.50. The whole reason they have these bend points is they figure low income people, they should get 90% of what they paid in. But the reason they had this law before they passed this, they said, well, somebody else has a secondary job that's making all this money. In fact, I added up right here, over $2 million. Should they get the same amount, the same percentage as somebody that's low income that doesn't have another job, at least a job they're not paying in Social Security? You get 90%. They were trying to make it kind of fair. And so the people that are working these second jobs that had these jobs where they weren't paying into it, they said they should be getting paid this 90% also on that first 1175. So hopefully this makes sense to you why this was passed. But you can actually use these. You can go to the Social Security website and actually figure out what you're getting. But actually, Social Security saves you all that trouble, and they tell you they figured all this out, the bend points and all that kind of stuff that you're making. Actually, for 2024, they actually raised this to 1225, so you get 90% of 1225. But that was kind of what was going on with the Social Security Fairness Act. People, they said about 3,200,000 people got this extra bonus now. Now they're getting 90% of this first amount instead of just 40% that they were getting before, because they changed the rules. We don't have this substantial earnings anymore. They basically said you get it all. You get 90% of what this first bend point is. Whatever you paid in Social Security, your PIA is right here. You're going to get 90% of that, not 40%. So it made a difference of basically almost doubling, more than doubling for a lot of people. These people that had these jobs that they weren't paying into Social Security, but a secondary job where they were. Hopefully this makes sense, folks. This is what we do on this channel. We set up all kinds of spreadsheets to kind of explain what's going on. The channel's called $1 Million Made Easy. Please consider subscribing. Please share this with others. We bring out all kinds of different videos, looking at all kinds of different numbers, and just to kind of show you where these numbers actually come from. Thanks so much for watching.